Perfect. Hi, everyone that's joined already. Minute early, so just going to wait for some more attendees to join and then we'll start shortly. Perfect. Give it one more minute. Perfect. Right, we'll get started then. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on mastering GHG emission reporting. It's nice to see a few of our clients have joined us, but for anyone new, my name's Jodie, and I'm the Partnerships Manager at Carbonology. So about us, we were originally a service within Blackmores, which is a larger consultancy specialising in the wider ISO standards. We began as a consultancy doing carbon accounting, and we're now a leading verification body. Everything we do as a verification body and a consultancy is in alignment with ISO 14064 and ISO 14065 and ISO 17029. We are accredited by the Carbon Disclosure Project, also known as CDP. And as of very recently, we are now a signatory of the Anti-Greenwash Charter as well. And for anyone new with us, at the end of the webinar, I'll be mentioning a limited time offer that we're currently running on our verification services. Without further ado, I will hand over to David. He's our principal carbonologist at Carbonology, our lead auditor, our lead consultant, our lead everything. And he'll be able to take you through the webinar. There'll be some time for questions at the end as well. Thank you. And David, feel free to take over.
Thanks, Jodie. Right, hopefully I'm showing my screen okay. I think we should have chosen a picture of me with a beard because I probably look quite different now. Right, so yeah, thank you for joining the webinar today. So I'll just give a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. So first we'll start off with the basics of the standard and then we'll get a bit more specific and detailed. Obviously, this is a webinar about a deep dive into 14064. So I'm going to be talking about the requirements of the standard, how to make a GHG report, and then I'm going to discuss some of the common challenges that I've countered in my experience as a consultant and a verifier. And then finally, we'll talk about GHG verifications, Jodie's already mentioned. So to get started with, 14064, it's got a very catchy title. Let's see if I can say it right. So specification with guidance at the organizational level for the quantification, reporting of GHG emissions and removals. So very catchy title. Two things I like to flag there. So it's at the organizational level. So plain English, that means it's for companies most of the time. It can be applied to other entities, like charities or local authorities, but most of the time it's for companies. The reason I flag this is just to mention it's not one for products or services directly, and it's easy to get them mixed up, but this one is very much for companies. The other thing to flag about the title is it mentions GHG reporting. So it's not just a standard about technical requirements and the maths and the numbers. It's an ISO management system. So it's about the wider management system to support your GHG reporting. And because it's an ISO standard, it has a structured and auditable approach. So if two companies, two different companies are implementing this, you can guarantee that they're following the same methodologies. A lot of people ask me about the difference between 14064 and the GHG protocol, which is another standard. I think, to be honest, this probably warrants a whole webinar on its own to discuss them. Our boss runs a podcast, Mel Blackmore. It's called the ISO Show. and she did an episode on that discussing the differences, which is well worth a listen. But if I was to sort of briefly discuss the differences, I'd say ISO 14064 is, as it says in the tin, it's an ISO standard. It sets high level requirements. You shall do this, you should do this. GHG protocols gives you very specific technical guidance. I refer to the GHG protocol fairly often. If I come across a situation that I haven't encountered before and I think, okay, what's the actual best way forward? I will often, look at the GHG protocol for technical guidance because it's really useful. Good news is that they are combining these. So ISO and GHG protocol are partnering up. I'm not sure of the details, but it sounds like they're partnering up and combining the standard. The good thing about that means that there'll be standardized technology, standardized terminology, not technology, terminology. And we'll discuss the categories in a moment, but there's different ways you can categorize emissions, and having that the same, I think, is going to be really useful for companies. GHG reporting is done on a 12-month cycle for companies. That normally aligns with the financial year end, but it doesn't have to. It's good to align with the financial year end because then you can report everything at the same time. So, your GHG results and financial results and any other metrics for your company, but it can be calendar year. A lot of companies opt to do that. It's something I personally prefer. The way you calculate emissions, we'll discuss that in a moment, but it's through the use of conversion factors, which are essentially just numbers. It's fairly simple maths once you've got all your ducks in a row, but the difficult part is actually getting hold of the data in the first place. So the principles, this is what I wanted to kind of start with in terms of our deep dive into the standard, because I think they are very important. They're something that guide me in my work every day as either a consultant or a verifier. And I think also, even if you've never heard of carbon accounting or you're not familiar with ISO, I think hopefully the principles should resonate with you because they do resonate with me, and it's something I rely on every day when I'm working. So the first one is relevance. So fairly simple concept. Everything you're doing should be relevant to the needs of the intended users. The intended users are those people or groups of people that are relying on your work to make decisions. And if you think about it, the information you're providing them needs to be relevant. The sources and methods should be appropriate to your scope of reporting. So this is a carbon standard. I think it's quite tempting when you're doing sustainability work to look at wider sustainability things, but this isn't a holistic standard. Like I say, 14,001, it's very much a carbon standard. So it's all about carbon and it should be relevant to that. Completeness, you could say this relates to greenwashing in a way. You need to take account of everything, include all your sites and all your sources. For a lot of companies, well, for some companies, this is quite simple. For larger companies, this is a bit more complex. But the point is you want to avoid any exclusions, whether that's a site, a physical facility, or a GHG source. You don't want to be having any exclusions. There are some justifiable exclusions. For instance, if something is, well, one, not relevant, if it's not material, if you're going to have to spend 5 hours trying to work out some maths for something that's going to add up to 0.01% of your emissions, you could argue it's justifiable to exclude that as long as you disclose that. And then there's also the elephant in the room is it physically possible? Do you have the data and is it technically feasible? Consistency. So this is a good one that I think is often overlooked. Be consistent with your methods, both within a reporting period and across reporting periods. Give you a practical example. If you've got different sites and you're estimating the consumption in different ways, say if you're doing one via headcount and one via floor space, I'm not saying one is right or one is wrong, but you need to be consistent with those methodologies because then it enables better comparison. And again, that's not just within a reporting period, that's across reporting periods. Not saying you shouldn't make improvements over time, but you need to be consistent. Accuracy. So again, going back to ISO giving quite high level, requirements, this is something I always fall back on when I'm doing my work is, the standard doesn't specifically say, you must calculate commuting like this, or you must do, business travel in a certain way in some regards, but it does say you need to be accurate. So it's something I always rely on when I'm doing verifications. If I see something that's not accurate, or I think it could be more accurate, I will generally raise it as either a non-conformity or a recommendation, depending on, the severity of it. So yeah, be accurate. That's the whole point of the standard. And finally, transparency. Again, a bit like completeness, you could say this relates to greenwashing. So basically, be transparent. What that means in practice is, disclose all the relevant information. doesn't have to be, an essay, but you need to be quite honest with your methods, estimates and assumptions. What have you done and how have you got to your results? Again, it's just a way that you can lower the risk of greenwashing, or at least try to lower that risk. And it's important to remember that people will be, relying on your work to make decisions. So they need all the information possible. So they've got better informed decisions. People could be using your work to say do sustainability submissions, or for like CDP, or EcoVadis or something, or they could be taking your work and putting that into a tender for new business. They need to rely on that confidently and be aware of how you've got to that and in a transparent manner. So that's the principles. So we've got relevance, completeness, consistency, accuracy, and transparency. Next, I wanted to touch on how to calculate GHG emissions. I won't talk about this too much because, again, I think that's something that warrants a whole webinar on its own. To start by defining organizational reporting boundaries, which is a fancy way of saying sites and sources, which I'll elaborate on in a moment. But again, going back to the principles, you want to include everything that's required of you and everything that's material. Next, you need to figure out who's got the data, which is easier said than done, but you need to find those people or entities, departments, whatever, that have got the data, reach out to them and collect it. You want to make that as easy and organized as possible for all parties, not just random emails, with random subject headers and, stuff like that. It needs to be an organized, neat and tidy approach, because that will certainly make everyone's life easier. Think about it, if you're collecting data off someone, they might not necessarily, it might not be their area of expertise. I always think, sometimes people fall into two camps of either they're very busy or they're, not super invested in it. So you just need to make it easy for them so you can get accurate information. That being said, when you get data, chances are it probably won't be usable off the get-go, so you'll need to process it and tidy it up. My advice here is, ask the subject matter expert nicely. Can they tidy it up for you? If you think about someone in, say, finance, for instance, if they're giving you all the spend data for your company, you don't necessarily need every single column and every single row of information to do your calculations. So, I always think ask nicely, and the subject matter expert might be able to do something in 5 minutes that could take, me an hour. So it's nice to just ask and they can save you some time. And you've got your calculations. Again, we've got the formula down here. I think formula is a bit of a fancy word for just timesing two numbers together and dividing them. But it's important just to highlight, that this is the easier bit. You've done the hard work. If you get into this part, you just choose your conversion factor and times them together. That's, out of all of these steps, that's the easier one. Not always, but usually. And then finally, categorization. So a lot of people in this call are probably familiar with emission scopes, so I won't go over that in too much detail, but every company that I've ever worked with reports to scopes 1, 2, and 3, their categorization. That's, I think, generally regarded as like the top level of categorization. But then there's different ways you can do that. So 14064 has 6 categories for GHG reporting, and the GHG protocol has 15 categories for scope 3. So it depends who you talk to. Different people use different things. I'm fine with, my clients using GHG protocol categories for the obvious reason that 15 is a bigger number as 6, and it just gives that extra level of granularity. So you'll often see categories 1 to 15 for GHG protocol. So key requirements of ISO 14064. So as I've already mentioned, defining organizational reporting boundaries. It's really important. You might think, oh, this would be a piece of cake. It's just a list of sites, but as the company gets larger, if you've got 100 sites, or we've got a client with like sort of 900 sites, it gets a bit more complex. Are all sites included? Again, if you're a larger company and you're constantly opening and closing sites or acquiring them, or you've got franchises or associate offices or investment sites, it becomes a bit more of a complex exercise. And it's just important because you don't want to be over or under reporting, accounting for a site you've already moved out of and just assuming you're there for 12 months, or if you're only there for 1 month, you don't want to be over or under reporting. It's can be a simple exercise, but it's something to keep an eye on because obviously it can change on an annual basis. Usually this is done via the operational control approach. So most organizations will look at the sites that they've got operational control over and include them. Next, significance policy. So for anyone I've audited, I think they probably think this is a trick question when I'm asking this, is what counts as a significant emission source to you? It's not a trick question because you need to know your significant emission sources so you can define your reporting boundaries, which again, is a fancy way of saying which sources are included. Super simple approach to this is just include all the big ones. If they're relevant to your material, you should include it. But you need to be aware of which ones you are potentially legally required to report on, or as part of commercial arrangements, or bank loans or something like that. You need to be aware of which sources you have to report on. And again, I'll probably repeat myself on this in the webinar, but any exclusions need to be justified. Basically, don't exclude anything without a valid, documented reason why. And of course, categorization, as I've mentioned, again, this sounds like a formality, but you need to categorize things correctly, because then year on year, you've got an accurate comparison, and things might look a bit weird year on year if they're not categorized correctly. Base year, so that's your comparison year that you're working forwards against or backwards against. It's your comparison year. For most companies, this is year one just by default, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you might find that you've got better data in year 2 or 3, and you want to set that as your base year. Or, which is a common thing when I started, is COVID. Obviously, for most companies, 2020 or maybe 2021 is not the ideal base year for most companies, not all. So, you want to think about what's going to cause you to change your base year, or, allow you to set a decent representative one. There's also the fact that, companies are growing. So if you're, acquiring new sites over time, you may want to think about a new base year. That being said, obviously, you still need to get to net zero by 2050. Intended users and responsibilities. So that's two things, but it often overlaps. It's basically the people involved with the project. Intended users I've already mentioned, but responsibilities is really important in a project. You need to assign responsibilities to people so they know what they're doing, just like any good project. Just think about who relies on that GHG information to make decisions, and as already mentioned, it needs to be accurate so they can make well-informed decisions. And as I've mentioned here, just assign people responsibilities. Who's in charge of what. Just be nice and clear to them. Intended uses, again, I always think this sounds like a trick question when I'm auditing people and companies. I'll say, why are we doing this? What's the point? Why are we doing this? It's not a trick question, because linking back to significance policy, you need to know what your reporting requirements are, whether they're legal, commercial, voluntary, CDP, Cavardis, SBTI, stuff like that. You need to be aware of what your reporting requirements are and what you're actually going to do with the GHG information, because it's all linked. That really helps define your reporting boundaries. Methodologies. So I've been quite lucky to work with some very, very clever people that do some crazy stuff with calculations, with cool stuff on Excel, coding, software, all sorts, stuff that's, actually beyond my expertise. And I say, okay, how have you done that? And they say, well, I just did it. It's all in my head. So great, we need to write that down, basically. So think about your methods. They need to be consistent and they need to be documented. It's no good if all the clever stuff is just locked away in your head. It needs to be shared with the rest of the team and documented. And then finally, dissemination of information. You've done all the hard work. What are you going to do with it? Again, it's kind of links to your reporting requirements, but you need to think about how you're going to share that information with the world. Is it going to go in a sustainability report at the end of the year? Is it going to go on your website? You're going to do a LinkedIn post about it, or maybe a webinar. You need to think about how you're going to disseminate that information to key stakeholders, because people are going to be interested about it. And of course, all of this needs to go somewhere, and it all needs to go in your GHG report. So I've done a few audits now where we start and I say, please show me your GHG report. And they say, David, what the hell's that? What's a GHG report? So, okay. Don't panic. It's okay. It's all right if you haven't got one. If you've done the calculations, that's probably 90% of the work done anyway, if not 95. I guarantee that if you are writing a GHG report from scratch, you probably have most of the information already. It's probably already to hand within, something that you already know or your team members will already know. It's quite a lot of information, but it's mostly simple stuff that you will already know. Probably shouldn't be saying this in a webinar about a deep dive into ISO 14064, but if you do have a tight deadline and you're up against it, get the standard and skip to clause 9. Clause 9 is all the points and requirements that you need for a GHG report. It's really useful because it is literally bullet points. I think it's letters, but whatever. It's it's points of things that need to go in the GHG report. Once you put pen to paper, you'll realize that, okay, this maybe is a bit of work and a bit of time, but it's nothing that you won't already know. Doesn't have to be a work of art. Again, if you are in a audit and you've got a tight deadline, the auditor is not going to care what it looks like. if you give me a GHG report, it can be in Comic Sans, black and white. I don't mind. That's fine. It's all about the content. But it's important to remember you don't have to get it through levels of approving of branding and stuff like that. It's absolutely okay. And another reason I mention this is it's an internal management system document. So obviously you want it to look nice, but you're not going to be sharing it with the world. So it can be simple. So it's just another way you can save time in an audit. So why do I actually need one? Why is this, auditor? Why is he making me write one? It's your documented approach to your GHG management system. So for those of you that have implemented other ISO standards, I guarantee you've written some stuff down and made some documents, and it's the same for this ISO standard. Another reason is you need it for third-party verification. It is a requirement, so you have to have this document to hand. It'll be one of the first things your auditor will ask you for. And it acts as a how-to guide for you and your team, as I think I've already mentioned. It might not be you doing the work next year, or might not be the project lead, or you may have limited involvement, or vice versa. You could find yourself you're leading the project this year or next year instead of the year before. But you need to make sure those methods are consistent, and this is the way of doing it. As I like to touch on, I think I was guilty in the past of writing essays and essays in my GHG reports sometimes, and it's fine for it to be bullet points and simple stuff. The analogy I use for writing a GHG report is think about it like like a cooking recipe. It can be simple steps and how-to guide. It's fine, but just think about either your future self or your future colleagues and making their life easier. And I'll just say this one last time, but most of the information you will have to hand, yourself or within your team. So next up, I'm going to talk about some of the common challenges in GHG reporting. I've got 10 here, by no means in order, although I think there is probably one that stands out as number one challenge. So I'll just go through those now. So human resources and internal support, going back to responsibilities, you need someone or a group of people to manage the project. I think it's really important from the get-go to assign a sort of top-level decision maker, almost like a project manager, someone running it. The challenge is here that, people have other things to do. To be honest, you might need them to help you, but they've probably got other responsibilities. Advice here is just let people know what you need from them, keep it clear, and just let them know what you need from them as soon as possible. The sooner you get that data, the better. And I'll keep banging on about it, but assign roles and responsibilities from the get-go and have regular sort of project meetings. Just treat it like you would any other project. Technical knowledge. So I think probably a lot of people in this call would agree with me that with GHG reporting, all of a sudden you're expected to know quite a lot about a very wide range of things. Where does my electricity come from? How does the HVAC work? Are we in a district cooling scheme? Flights, business travel, all sorts of stuff, upstream leased assets. But there's a lot to know. I think one thing to remember is it's a learning curve. You'll have people to help you and, learn with. So you're not expected to know everything overnight. But the reason I flagged this is, training. So flag from the get-go if you need training, whether that's, high-level training on sort of the basics of carbon accounting or something more specific, how to get better at Excel, to speed things along. So flag if you need training and don't worry if you don't know everything from the get-go because it is a learning curve. Budget, so money. I know we're British, most of us, we don't like talking about it, but it's something you've got to consider. One way or another, these projects aren't free. Even if you're doing it completely solo, it's still going to take up your time. But generally, there's about 4 things that usually come into the budget that you have to be mindful of for a project. So you've got external consultancy support, so someone's come in and help you, potentially do some stuff for you and guide you. External verifier, auditor. Software. There's different ways that software is built. It could be based off the number of sites or users, or it could be a flat fee. But either way, it's not free most of the time. And then the other cost that's I'd say often overlooked is submission fees for platforms. Again, your SBTI, CDP, EcoVadis, etc., etc. The costs vary and they depend on each company, but most of the time they're not free. So just be mindful of the budget and be clear to, the people that control the budget. What is this going to look like on an annual basis? And I guess, the elephant in the room there for budget is that's before you've even done any carbon reduction stuff. That's a whole other, spend. International considerations. So I always like to flag this because it does directly relate to practical challenges that you'll have to think about. So Obviously, it's more applicable to large companies that work around the world. But if you're relying on your colleague that's in a different time zone to get you some piece of information or pieces of information then and there for an audit, and they've just clocked off for the day, and they're in the pub and then they've gone to bed, they're not going to get you the information you need for potentially 12 hours or 24 hours, whatever. So be mindful of time zones. I know it sounds obvious, but it's just about letting people know when you might need them. The other thing about working internationally is people in a different country might not use the same unit of measurement as you. So you want to be clear what the information is they're providing you. So be helpful to them. If you're giving them a form, give them an option to disclose a unit of measurement or a drop down or request that they give you a specific unit of measurement. And I know that sounds really minor in the grand scheme of things, but conversion factors work off specific units of measurement. So when you're doing an international project, it's important to, nail that down. Data availability and engagement. So I think most people, if they were to rank these into sort of the top ones, I think probably data availability is the number one challenge. Getting hold of it either internally is arguably easier, but getting hold of external data is very hard. So my tips there are act now. It's better to act now and get 3 months worth of data than none, because at least you can do something with that. You can also help set expectations for the data provider that, they're going to need to give you this data year on year. Find the right points of contact, again, internally and externally. Find the people that have the data, ask them nicely, and give them a nice, easy, standardized way for them to present the data to you, because they're busy people. They need to have an easier way to give it to you. In terms of data linked to suppliers, when you're looking at purchase goods and services or potentially capital goods, ask them to do the hard work. They may just be able to literally give you the information then and there. Probably won't happen. But if you email them or call them, set up a meeting, whatever, your supply chain may be able to just give you what you need. In reality, though, you're probably going to have to jump on the internet and do some research. Luckily, a lot of large companies now do publicly disclose their GHG reporting. So once you've gathered enough sustainability reports and done a bit of maths, based around your spend and their turnover and stuff like that, you can probably do a lot of your supply chain yourself. Not saying that's always going to be the case, but there's a lot of publicly available information now in databases that you can use. And one final thing for data availability, and I'll keep saying this, but keep annoying your landlord. It's okay. They won't say that. They won't like that. But you're the one paying for your gas, electricity, water, heating, cooling, waste, whatever. I like to think that companies should have visibility of that consumption and their spend. So maybe not annoy is the right word, but keep asking nicely for your landlord or building manager to get that information. The other thing there is, can you get it yourself? Can you physically access the meters? Obviously, get permission, and please don't electrocute yourself based off my advice. But if you can open a cupboard and do a meter reading once a month, that's going to, save you a lot of time, and you'll have great visibility of your consumption. And, if it's just 1 meter, it'll probably only take 5 minutes once a month. Again, for most companies. So input error, this is quite a common challenge, is basically, putting the wrong information in. It's not the worst crime, but it does happen. Challenges here that, you're dealing with a lot of data, particularly for scope 1 and 2. Use the example of electricity. If you've got 12 bills for one site and you've got 10 sites, there's 120 bills that you might have to input. Even if you're using software, which can really speed things along and do a lot of the work for you, you may still have to do a bit of human input to get that data usable. Good way to overcome this challenge is get someone to check your work. I think as humans, we're often a bit blind to our own mistakes. So do find someone, that you work with and just say, can you please just review this and do some spot checks? Because it's much easier for someone else to spot errors than it is for you. That's, why I do auditing. It's generally easier to do it that way. Changing boundaries. So very common for companies. Most companies want to grow. They want to keep making money, hiring new staff, increasing revenue, new sites and stuff. But obviously that goes at odds with carbon reduction. Generally, as a company grows, most of the time, the carbon emissions will also grow with the company. It's important to keep track of your boundaries. Again, organizational boundaries, you want to make sure you're including everything that's relevant. But the thing here is we all need to get to net zero at some point, but you can display your efficiency improvements through intensity ratios. So always remember, you don't just have to report on absolute emissions. Well, you do, but something you can use to report alongside that are intensity ratios. So say if you normalize your ton CO2 against your headcount or turnover each year, that way you may be able to display that you are making efficiency improvements, even though you're growing as a business. It means you can demonstrate you're getting more sustainable. Again, with the big caveat that you still need to get to net zero eventually. Changing requirements. This is a tricky one. There's so many abbreviations out there. I can't remember what half of them stand for, let alone what the detailed requirements are for some of them. But I think the way you can overcome this is make sure you've got time in the diary to identify what the requirements are. What do they call it? Alphabet soup, all these acronyms and stuff. Find out which ones are applicable to you, find out what you need to do. And, it's important to make time to do that. Not necessarily saying you have to be the world's leading expert in every single reporting requirement, but you do need to know if your company is relevant, and what the applicable requirements are. So yeah, keep an eye on the requirements. Good news though, it's something that helps keep me sane, that once you've done your inventory and your carbon reporting, you have done most of the work. Not all of the work. There's a lot of these things you have to submit to. There's a lot of forms to fill out and a lot of typing. But once you've got the numbers, I think that is a lot of the work, at least from a carbon perspective anyway. Greenwashing and getting it wrong. So I think broadly speaking, it's a bit of a generalization, but companies fall into two camps. There's the ones that do it on purpose and don't really give a monkeys because they want to look good, and they will purposely greenwash, and ideally you don't want them to do that. But I think more commonly, luckily in my experience, it's the opposite. Companies want to do the right thing, but they generally downplay their achievements because they don't want to be accused of making any false statements. I think the term for that is green hushing. It's when you kind of downplay your achievements relating to sustainability. But advice here is if something is verifiable or has been verified, there's nothing stopping you making that claim. Again, this might want to chat with I'm not an environmental lawyer, but if something is truthful and has been verified, there's nothing stopping you making that claim. So don't be afraid of celebrating your achievements. In terms of getting it wrong, sometimes things will go wrong, hopefully nothing major. But I wanted to flag this because I'm always a great supporter of making retrospective changes and amendments. So it's better to have something that's accurate, even if it does mean, sending a few emails, maybe annoying someone because they've got to change a report, or maybe, within reason, republish something or update it for the next year. But it's better to have accurate results and then transparently disclose why there's been changes than just let a mistake live there, for the rest of the time. And finally, how do I get started? So I've got another whole slide on this. So I wanted to discuss it in a bit more detail. When I was starting out as a carbonologist many years ago, I did lots of training and reading and stuff. I thought, okay, what do I actually do first then? So first thing, maybe a bit cheeky, but buy the standard. Next, you're going to want to read it. Again, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but if it is a tight deadline, skip ahead to clause 9, because that will certainly be a useful exercise. Organizational boundaries. I know I've mentioned this before, but just start by putting pen to paper, figure out what your sites are. Again, if you're a smaller company, that might be a 5-minute job. If you're a large company, that's going to take a bit more work, and it's going to be an ongoing thing to monitor that. Again, something I do want to flag is, make sure there's time in the diary to do this. It shouldn't just be a side project. I know everyone's got things to do, but this does take up a bit of time, at least in the first few years. So make sure you've got time in the diary to do that research, to figure out what your reporting boundaries are. Data collection plan. So as I've mentioned, there shouldn't just be some haphazard emails and a Word document. It needs to be structured and organized, even down to if you are sending emails, what's your subject header? Is it site data collection and a date, or is it just give me some data, please? Stuff like that needs to be traceable and auditable, because you're only doing yourself a favor and you're also helping the data provider with their work. So outline what you need, find out who has it and how it should be presented, and just keep it standardized and simple for the person that's giving you the data. Next, you're going to want to decide if Excel or software, or potentially a mix, is most appropriate for your company. I've seen some large companies do really, really cool stuff with Excel. Some smaller companies, with really cool software. But the general rule of thumb is the larger your company, the greater your justification for software. Software can do all sorts of crazy stuff, speed things along. It can do the calculations for you, do the reporting for you. I wouldn't say it's a magic silver bullet for everything, but it can certainly speed things along. And I think one great feature of software is it can help with target setting. We do have some software partners actually, so if any of you are thinking about, getting yourself on a software, let us know and we can put you in contact with some great people. And familiarize yourself with conversion factors. So this is one of the first things I did when I was getting started is literally download the DEFRA conversion factor spreadsheet. It's not a very exciting activity, but literally download the spreadsheet, go through each tab and read it. That is really important because it shows what data format you need to do the calculations. You take the example of business travel. It has a list of what types of cars there are, which I know sounds obvious, but it really help you when it comes to data collection. Oh, we need to split it out by fuel type, or if it's electric or hybrid or a large engine, small engine, stuff like that. So read the conversion factors. Not particularly riveting, but we're quite lucky in the UK that DEFRA publish them every year. So do download them and have a read if you're getting started. Final slide from me. Just wanted to talk about GHG verification. As I mentioned, we are a consultancy and a GHG verifier. We don't do that at the same time. That would be very naughty. If someone's coming to you and saying, we'll calculate your emissions and verify you, don't let them. That's bad. That's very much something we avoid. So we're very strict on keeping that separated. But what is GHG verification? So it's independent checks on the accuracy, completeness, and reliability of your results and methodologies. Essentially, it is an audit. Why? Why would you do it? So it demonstrates credibility, transparency, and trust, to your external stakeholders. You'll see we've got a verification mark there down in the right-hand side. So that's our mark that we provide to clients that we have externally verified and independently verified to show that, this is our mark. We put our stamp on it and they can demonstrate they've been through this process. On a more personal note, as someone that does carbon calculations, I'm a big fan of the verification allows you to spot opportunities for improvement that you may not necessarily have been aware of before. This is a great way to make continual improvement over time, like with any ISO standard, but it also minimizes the chance of you publishing incorrect results. How? So the way we do it is a mixture of in-person and remote audits. So most of the time will be remote just for practical reasons. The fact we don't want to be driving around and getting flights and, incurring emissions. But most audits now we will do a site visit just to make sure everything's okay. Most of our time will be spent in isolation, us sort of typing away on our laptops, checking your quantification approach. So checking, is the maths correct? Correct conversion factors. Does it match the evidence? Our estimation methodologies, complete and accurate, stuff like that. So a lot of it is about the calculations and making sure the output is correct. Yeah, get in touch if you'd like to know more about verification. Jodie, I'm just going to hand back over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you, David, for that. I just wanted to discuss that discount that I mentioned earlier. So in October and November, we'll be doing 10% off. This offer ends on the 30th of November, and it also applies to a single annual audit in October and November, not our 3-year plans. So if you'd like some more information on that, then there's my email there. On the left-hand side as well is a QR code, which will take you to our readiness review, which we send to prospective clients just to find out a little bit more info about your company and current sustainability efforts, which will lead to a more informative conversation when we eventually speak. We've got a little bit of time as well for questions. So if anyone's got any questions for David, please pop it in the Q&A box just at the top of the screen there, and we can do our best to answer. Just give a couple minutes for that. Everyone's gone shy.
Should we do a quick plug for the ISO show, Jodie?
Yes, of course. So I think David mentioned our podcast earlier on called the ISO Show, which is something Mel, I'm sure some of you have met Mel, our CEO and founder, manages as well. So it's got quite a decent following, and we love to have our clients on the podcast as well. Great. We've just had a question, David. So what are the 6 categories in ISO?
Oh, that's a good question. Wish I had them written down in front of me. So it's well, scope 1 and 2 are category 1 and 2. That's always easy to remember. And you've got transportation 3, upstream, downstream 4 and 5, and then 6 is the other category. God, put me on the spot there. If someone asked me to do categories 1 to 15 for GHG protocol, won't be able to get those all listed off. But yeah, hopefully that answers that. Scope 1 and 2 are the same. 3 transport, 4 and 5 downstream from your company, and then 6 is the other indirect one. So example, I think we put home working a lot of the time in category 6. You could argue that's linked to commuting, which is transport, but other categories there for a reason.
Perfect. Thank you. We've got a second one as well. Could you give a bit of advice on hybrid calculation for category 1, 2, and auditing of these?
Oh, it's a good one. Yeah, I mean, obviously the easiest in most of the time is completely spend based, but that's obviously not a great depiction of your supply chain. I believe I'm not sure how you get hold of the data, but if you're a CDP submitter, you can get certain databases off CDP and do the CDP hybrid method where you kind of take your suppliers' emissions and then normalize that against your spend with them and their turnover. So hypothetically, if you were responsible for, say, 1% of your suppliers' turnover via your spend, you could, again, hypothetically say you're responsible for 1% of their emissions. So that's a good way of doing it because you're not just using industry averages, you're using your specific supplier emissions, and then you're almost making a kind of bespoke conversion factor just for you and your supplier, which is really useful because it gives a much better representation. In terms of Cap 2, capital goods, tech's quite a good one. We're quite fortunate that a lot of big tech companies, laptops, phones, whatever, they publish LCAs online and product declarations. So with a bit of research, you can find those, and then you can compare things. I'm not saying you'll always have a choice over what you're buying as a company. If you're doing mass orders of 1,000 laptops, but you can at least compare and see which is more sustainable.
Perfect. Thank you. We've just had another question about the ISO show. I'll send that to you following on from the webinar, Andrew. I'll send it to you in an email if that's okay. There might be a couple other questions, but of course. I got asked a question actually the other day, which might be helpful. How long does it usually take for a company to gather all the data needed for their first GHG report?
It's a good question. I think this is a bit of a unhelpful answer, but usually you don't get a choice. Normally, the period between your year end and your submission deadlines is usually only a few months. So if I was to give a very general answer, I'd probably say about a month for the average company, but you are often dictated by your deadlines. Sometimes companies sort of have self-imposed deadlines, which doesn't help. But I'd say a couple of months, especially if you're reaching out to, say, hundreds of people and you're getting information back. But yeah, usually a couple of months.
Perfect. Thank you. On the topic actually of the ISO show, following on from the webinar, I'll put it in the chat. So everyone should have easy access to that following on from here. But if you don't, then just get in contact with me and I can send it direct as well. Cool. Perfect. Well, if any other questions come up or you'd like to discuss the offer that we've got going on in October and November, then please contact David or myself, and we'd love to have a chat with you. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I hope you have a great week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.